Now, into the stories, we're going to talk about firstly this vice presidential pick. So everybody was really expecting it to be Josh Shapiro, out of the governor of Pennsylvania. Some people thought it was Mark Kelly of Arizona, but we sort of had this dark horse, this new person pop out of nowhere, really, which is Tim Walz. He's the governor of Minnesota. Now, quick notes about him. Before he was the governor of Minnesota, he was a member of the House of Representatives from 2007 to 2019. And as the governor of Minnesota, he's completely embraced the leftist agenda, whether that be legalization of cannabis, the LGBTQ AI plus agenda, which he's been involved in since the late 90s. If you look into that, when the George Floyd riots were happening, Tim Walz completely let his own state burn to the ground, giving concessions to the rioters and the protesters rather than defending the police. Now, so it's the whole nine yards when it comes to the leftist agenda. And it's also interesting to look into his personal and religious background, because it would seem that this man was raised a Catholic. This is something that wasn't reported on until really early this week. We had barely any information about this. We knew that his great grandfather was Catholic, but what's come out recently, even the New York Times, I believe, reported on this. His parents were Catholic, and it would seem he was baptized as a Catholic. He eventually would marry his wife, who was a Minnesotan Lutheran, and now he is a part of the Evangelical Lutheran Church, which, if you know anything about that, extremely LGBT, part of that agenda, barely even Christian, and he's a part of that. So he apostatized. Now, looking outside of his religious sphere of life, we see that he's trying to portray himself as quite a normal guy, and that's really the type of messaging that the Democratic Party clearly wanted in selecting Governor Tim Walz. He was a coach and a teacher at a Nebraskan high school. He did his Master of Science on Holocaust education, which is honestly quite out of place. It's quite interesting to see that just pop out in the middle of nowhere. I struggle to see why that was his Master of Science. Of course, that is something you can do, but it is an interesting note. There's a lot of interesting tidbits like that throughout his whole life. And once we get to that, the basic facts of this man, this sort of educated man, goes to teach at these various schools. He was also in the National Guard, we find out. He's been a part of the National Guard. There's been some questions about his whether or not he abandoned his duty, which we'll get into in a bit. Now, there's really two ways you can view Tim Walz, and there's two narratives I've really seen brought up about Tim Walz. And the first, which is really in the mainstream media, and you see it in alternative media as well, is that he is this left-wing populist who is in a way a sort of bumbling idiot, but still cares about the people and is sincere. You see this in many aspects of this is very inconvenient for the GOP angle on Governor Walz. So, for example, he's gotten an A+ rating from the NRA before. You'll see pictures of him with these firearms, going out hunting and things. And he does have an A+ rating from the NRA, at least has in the past. He started to become a little bit more anti-firearm recently with some of the mass shootings. He has a very normal looking family, and he's been opposed to the Iraq war. These populist positions are things that got Donald Trump elected. And some people will say that there was an issue with right before his National Guard battalion went off to Iraq, he decided to leave it and went to Congress instead, focused on that instead. And some people will say that's stolen valor, the fact that he claims to be a National Guard. And he was in the National Guard, but the fact that he did that, some people will say that's just stolen valor. Others will say he's just principally objecting to the Iraq war. Now, we can also see he's against money in politics. He himself has zero disclosed investments, which is very rare for politicians. The mainstream will say that's because he's living off pensions. Others will say that's a bit more suspicious, or even some people will say this just makes him an idiot. He has no financial capabilities. So with all of this in mind, those policies are really what got Trump, or at least though that attitude, that populist attitude, are things that helped the Trump movement in 2016. And that's obviously what the Democrats are looking to do. They're looking for that sort of similar energy to help them with those Midwestern states in the upcoming election. And I really think he will be a strong candidate for the vice presidential spot there, just to defend against JD Vance. I think he'll end up doing very well in those debates just on that optics point of view. And if I were JD Vance, the important thing is to get him on the issues, whether that be the LGBT agenda, the abortion rights, which this man has absurd abortion advocacy has been Tim Walz's thing. So if JD Vance can really capitalize on that, I think the Republicans will be fine. But if we stop here for a second, there's another side that you can see Tim Walz as being a part of, and you can see him being as something different rather than this sincere populist. There is many people have pointed out that he could be an insincere operative. One thing that is not often reported in this is that Tim Walz spent a lot of time in China before he went back to the National Guard and taught in the United States. Spent a lot of time in China. I'll pull up this article. He taught for this organization called World Teach, which is sort of like the Peace Corps, but there's very suspicious things involved in this whole thing. For example, if we read it at the bottom here, it says after a year in the schools, he spent 3 months traveling through China by bus. Entering rural China was like stepping back 100 years. You can see it there in this article. His wife and he also honeymooned in China right after they got married. And look, if one of our audience members was to say, look, I taught in China for a few years, that's a small thing. We would say, oh, well, that's, there's people like teaching abroad. But when you have somebody who is deeply involved in the military, one of the highest non-commissioned officers to ever serve, highest ranking non-commissioned officers to ever serve in the United States Congress, when you have somebody deeply involved in the state and for the Democratic Party, I think it's fair to be relatively suspicious that this man spent 3 months doing who knows what in China. This man speaks Mandarin Chinese. There's something there, and when we start questioning the narrative a little bit, seeing that there are these weird gaps in his life, I think some of his actions begin to make more sense. Was his dropping out of the military just cowardice, not wanting to go to Iraq, the Iraq War, excuse me, or was that something more sinister? Was there some sort of group that wanted him as doing higher things, doing things like rapidly ascending in U.S. politics? Would he be an asset wasted in the Iraq War? Is he a populist because he deeply cares about the issues, or is he just saying what the people want, changing on a dime just to perpetuate what the deep state wants? I think that is something everybody should look into. And when you're dealing with an apostate, which we know Tim Walz is, a man without any principle because he's willing to abandon the faith of his fathers, a generational Catholic family, he's willing to abandon that on a dime for this liberal Lutheran church. I don't see it as out of the question that this man could be compromised, whether as being a deep state asset, a CIA asset. I don't see that as being out of the question. It would align with some of these things, like being in China randomly for months out of his early life, where we don't even know what he did over there. I think we need to start asking those questions. But I'm curious to know what our audience thinks. If you can leave a comment there, maybe in the live chat, I'd like to see what you think. Am I crazy for thinking that there might be more to this? There might be something involved with the deep state, something else, rather than this man just being a nice teacher from Minnesota, which is obviously what he's being portrayed as.